In this set of videos, I'll be prototyping some game systems. Primarily, this is going to be prototyping around using Unity dots. I've been interested in the dots setup for quite a while, and I would like to do some work around it. At the point where I'm making this video, it's not quite released yet, and they're still making some reasonably large changes to systems like the transforms, so this will start with a standard Unity project. I'm going to be making the majority of the assets from scratch. This is because I want to work on a visual style, and I do not want to import in anybody else's visual style. I'll also be spending a lot of time focusing on controls for this, and building a world based off those controls. This is primarily a prototype of a control system, and this is going to be an animation-based control system. This is being done with no expectation that this will ever become a game. Instead, I want to do in-depth work on controls. This is also related to another project which I want to work on, which is that I'm working on a game engine. This engine is not specifically aimed at making a game. The primary purpose of the game engine that I'm working on is to improve my low-level programming and my knowledge of the fundamentals of 3D software. It also allows me to work on things which you cannot work on with the current off-the-shelf game engines. Currently, I'm making the game engine with two languages. The one language is a language which I'm experimenting with, and the other would be my default option, which would be C, or more precisely C++ with a C approach. The other language which I'm working with is a newer language which is called Odin. This is a C alternative which I'm experimenting with. There are other C alternatives, but this is the one which I want to experiment with at the moment. So for the most part, I'm going to be building and prototyping the elements for the game in Unity, but if the engines get far enough, I may start to do some building and prototyping within them as well. The majority of the assets will be made in Houdini. I will also be using ZBrush. I have not decided on which final texturing options I'm going to use yet, and textures will comprise the bulk of my third-party assets, along with sound. I will attempt to build this in a manner that can be scaled to a larger project. I'll be using two major version control systems for this project. One will allow me to have a local version control and can be expanded to a server-based version control if the project grows, and that will be Perforce Helix. I will also be using source control via Git, specifically using GitHub and SourceTree. I'll start in Perforce. I'm going to be creating a couple of depositories here. Under the Tools submenu, I'll open the Administrator window. I'll open the Depots tab. Then under the File menu, I'll add a new depot. Currently, this depot will be stored locally. If I ever have the funding or the project gets big enough, I can create a proper server for this, but for the moment, all the depositories will be stored locally. Perforce is also free for 5 people. If you scale beyond that, it gets more expensive, but at this level, it will cost me nothing to have this as my initial setup. If I'm actually at the point where I can employ 5 people, I should actually have enough money to expand Perforce at that point in any case. I'll be creating 3 depots. The first one will be for the game. This will have a working title UD. This will be a stream depot. That's the only setting which I'm needing to change at the moment. I can then apply to create the depot. I'll be creating a couple of depots for the related game engines. The engine itself is going to be called Trimble. Once again, this will be a stream depot. I can then apply to create it. This should be fine to start with. As these are at the moment, they will not work. I'll need to create a stream graph. I'll open up the stream graph pane. I'll start with the Trimble engine. I'll create a new stream. This stream will be called main. This should be the mainline stream. I'll turn off the options to create a workspace. I will also not be populating the repository at the moment. I have already created the workspace folders in any case, so I'll link those up later. I should now have a main stream node showing. If I double click on this, I'll get the option to work on the stream. This will give us the option to create a workspace for this. This will allow me to specify the workspace manually. I'll specify my workspace folder. I can set some of the options in advance. I should probably be setting this up more strictly and pay more attention to these options, but at the moment it will only be me working in this repository, so it will not strictly matter if I break things here. I'll set this up to revert unchanged files, and for the moment I'll set all files to be readable and writable. This would not be a good idea in a studio context, as it does actually circumvent a lot of the reasons for having version control, but currently I'm the only person working on this, so more strict version control practices are not necessary at the moment. I will turn off Switch to Workspace immediately. I'll go back to the main tab. I haven't actually named the workspace yet. I'll give the workspace the same name as the workspace folder. In this case, it will be Workspace Frimble. I'll then press OK to save. I'll get a message to say that this workspace isn't empty. The reason this is not empty is I've already created a p4ignore file. This will prevent me from tracking files which I do not need. So I'll say no, and I'll create my workspace. We will then get the request to populate the file system. If we have an existing project, we can move that project into this depot. We'd use the populate option here. However, this is currently an empty project, so I will not actually be adding anything. So I'll cancel to exit this window. So that will create my first workspace, and I should be able to access this from the Workspace tab. In this depot, I'll have the p4ignore file. I can double-click on this file to open it. This is based off a default document which is published on the Perforce website, but I have modified it slightly. I'm not going to be editing this now, so I can close this. I'll now work on my second depot. I'll add a stream graph for this as well. This will also be called main and will be a mainline stream graph. I'll make sure that the depot is UD. I can then create the stream. I'll then specify the workspace manually. I'll browse through my folders. This workspace will be called Workspace UD. I'll allow writable, and I'll revert changes. I'll not automatically populate anything. I can create the stream. I can create the workspace. I've got nothing to populate this with, so I can cancel. That should set up the depots for the main project. So these are my two workspaces. Both of them only have a p4ignore file in them. I'm going to add some folders to these workspaces. In the UD project, I'll have a Unity folder, and for the moment I'll add a C folder as well as an Odin folder to the Frimble project. In these folders, I'm going to create Git projects. Git will only really apply for programming, but it will provide me external storage for anything which I'm programming. I'll be setting up GitHub repositories for all three of these folders. At the moment, I do not have the time or patience to learn Git through the command line. I'm not really a programmer, so learning Git is not a major priority for me. Instead, I'm going to manage Git using SourceTree, which is a free Git client from Atlassian. So I'm going to be creating repositories here. First, I'll get the path to my Unity folder. I'm going to remove Workspace from the Git repository name. I'll then create my repository here. I'll then create a repository for my C folder. I'll get the folder path here. I'm going to have separate repositories for the C project and the Odin project. In the long term, I'll probably end up dropping one of these, and they're separate projects in any case, but for the moment I'm going to keep them in a single Perforce repository. I can always separate them later. I'll then create the repository for the Odin version of the engine. So I've created the three repositories. I'll now actually need to link them to my GitHub account. In the GitHub account, I'll add a new repository. This will be called UD. For the moment, these are all going to be private. These are not intended to be public projects. This is more of a documentation of me making the projects than it is a series of tutorials. So these are very much still personal projects. So I'll create the repository here. I'll copy my address. In SourceTree, I'll open the repository settings. I'll add a remote. I'll paste my URL here. I'll call the remote master. I can then try link this. I'll then create my next repository here. So this repository will be for the C version of my Frimble engine, and will be called Frimble C. I've just realized that I've linked the wrong repository. I've linked the Frimble Odin repository to the UD repository. I will remove this repository path. I'll need to set this up with my UD repository. I'll go to the repository settings. I'll add a remote. I'll paste my path here. This will be called master. So this will update the repository here. Here I have one file which is my p4ignore file. I do not actually need to track this file, so I'm going to add this file to my gitignore file. I will right click on this and I'll select ignore. I'll call this initial commit. I'll stage my new gitignore file and I'll commit this repository. I can return to GitHub. I'll finish creating my Frimble-C repository. Once again, this will be a private repository. I won't change many of the settings, but I'll create my repository. I'll copy my repository path. In SourceTree, I'll go to my repository settings. I'll add a configuration. I'll paste my path here, and the branch will be master once again. This will currently have no files in it, so I will not commit anything yet. I'll then add my final repository. This will be called Trimble Odin. Once again, this is going to be a private repository. Once again, I'll copy the path. I'll add a repository for this branch. I'll add a remote for this repository. I'll paste the path here, and this branch will be called master. That will give me my main repositories for the setup. Next, I'm going to create my Unity project. I'll be creating a base project here. This is going to be an empty 3D project. We do have options to use presets here, but one of the advantages Unity has is that you can have very minimalist projects starting. This is not necessarily the easiest way to start a project. For example, it can be far easier to start in Unreal, where you generally have a lot of very good settings created by default. But if you want to work at things at a low level, or work on your understandings of how all the visual aspects of your project work, the starting point that Unity gives you is often a lot better. I'll install the engine in my workspace folder, under the Unity folder, and for the moment I'm going to call this project UD. I can then create my project. I should note that I'm installing the wrong version of Unity here. This is the beta version. I should actually be installing the LTS version. So now Unity has been loaded, and I can start to set up my project. I'll start by working in the project settings, and I'm going to work on the player settings. Here I'm going to be setting up the APIs. This will be under Other Settings. I'll turn off Auto API for Mac and Linux. I will also not be using Auto API for Windows. I'm going to start with the Windows APIs. For the moment, I'll leave DirectX 11 here as an option, but the default Windows API will be DirectX 12. I'll change this, and this will require an editor restart. I will then go to the Package Manager. As I said, I'm not going to be using a lot of assets, but there is one asset which I'll use in all of my Unity projects. This compensates for one of Unity's deficiencies, and that is the organization of folders, specifically the ability to customize the folders, and in this case to give the folders a specific color. This is one of those places where Unreal beats Unity, as Unreal has folder customization by default. The asset which I'm going to be using is called Rainbow Folders 2. Then I'll go to the Unity registry, and here I can look at which packages I'm going to install. By default, Unity will install a set of packages called Engineering. This will include packages for Visual Studio, for Rider, as well as editor coroutines, the profile analyzer, and the test framework. It will also include code coverage. A lot of these are very useful, but I do not actually need all of them, and there are certain of these which I will not be using. For example, JetBrains Rider is just out of my budget and I cannot afford it. If I was going to change IDEs, I would also want to move more to a traditional text-based editor, for example something like NeoVim. However, I do not have the time or inclination to learn NeoVim at the moment. So I'll remove this engineering bundle. Since I'm not going to use all of these, having them all connected together does not help me. I'd prefer to have control over individual packages. I'll then add back in the Visual Studio Editor, as this will be the default editor that I'm using. I'll make sure I've added in the test framework. While I'm not a strict believer in things like test-driven development, unit tests can be very useful, especially when testing mathematical functions. It's always good to make sure you can get correct results in certain circumstances, particularly regarding to memory or mathematics, and unit tests can help enforce that. They don't work in all scenarios, and they're not a magic bullet, but the testing framework is set up and I can use it, so I will use it. I'll leave code coverage for the moment. I'm not going to try and have 100% code coverage. That's a very corporate approach to programming. There's only so much time I have as an individual person working on a project. This is also a prototype, so a lot of this code is going to be quick and nasty, and I expect to do a lot of rewriting. So if this develops into an actual workable project, I'll need to rewrite the majority of it later. I'll then install the HDRP. If I release this, this will either be released for consoles or it will be released for PC. And the HDRP will give me the best options for rendering for either of these platforms. It will also give me the best options for my own personal use. I could try to install the entities package now, but I am going to avoid working on this until the new LTS comes out, as I do not want to deal with any fundamental updates to how the code works at the moment. I'll then add the input system. This is the new version of the input system, and we can completely replace the old system with this. Some people will use the old system for tutorials for ease of use. There's actually no point in this, as it is actually easier to set up very basic controls with the new system than it is with the original input system. In this case, I'm going to be setting up very makeshift controls, and this is going to be at a much more basic level than anything you can do with the original system. I'll get the option to enable the new input system. By default, this will fully disable the old system. I'll select yes here. So now I should have the input set up. I should also have the setup for the HDRP. So those will be all the packages which I'm going to start with. Next, I'll go to the window. I'll go to rendering, and I'll go to the HDRP wizard. By default, the HDRP will not be set up properly, and we want to initialize it here. We'll see a number of warnings here that we'll need to fix. This wizard will allow us to fix most of these automatically, and it will give us a lot of default settings on the HDRP. To do this, I'll press the Fix All button. Halfway through this process, it will ask us if we want to create a default HDRP asset. If you do not create one here, it will make your life reasonably difficult, as you'll have to create it manually. I would always create an asset here. While we will do the manual setup eventually, it's not really worth the effort of having to do it now. I'll turn off Show and Start. Then I'll go to the DXR tab. This is where we will enable ray tracing features. I'll fix all of the options here as well. There will still be a couple of warnings, but I can deal with those later. So that will give me my default start for Unity. I can return to source tree to work on my repository. I'll start by adding entries to my gitignore. I'll start by ignoring the Visual Studio config file. I'll right click on this and I'll select ignore. In this case, I'll ignore this exact file name. I could also choose to ignore the solution file, but I'll leave this for now. Everything that is in the asset folder is something which I should consider adding, so I'll include anything in the assets folder which is not specifically part of a plugin or package. I do not want to include my plugins folder, so I'll ignore this. I'll set this to ignore anything beneath Unity /assets /plugins. I want to keep my sample seeds. However, I want to exclude everything within the Unity library, so I'll ignore this. I'll ignore the entire folder, and I'll ignore anything beneath Unity UD library. We can ignore all of the logs as well. We will also ignore all of the Unity packages. We can ignore everything beneath the project settings, as well as all of the temporary files. I'll also ignore all of the user settings. I can now open my gitignore to see what it contains. I'll organize this a little bit, and then I'll save the changes. I can then stage all of the remaining files. I'll call this Unity install. I'll then commit all of these files. All of these changes can then be pushed to the remote GitHub repository. That will give my initial commit for Unity. Next, I can take a look at Perforce. Here I already have the p4 ignore file, and this should ignore most of the Unity folders which I do not need. Here I'll select everything for the initial commit, and I'll check everything out. I'll then look at my pending window. I'll select everything again, and I'll mark it for add, and we should get a pop-up which shows us a lot of files which are being ignored. If I look at the pending now, we'll see that we've got certain files which are going to be marked as add. I do not actually want to include the project settings directory, so I'll add this to my p4 ignore file. I will also add the packages folder here. Another folder which I do not want to have here is my plugins folder. I've went through all of my files and reverted the files which I do not need to have stored. All the remaining pending files here can be submitted, and I'll label this commit Unity install. I can submit this, and this should give me my basic project setup. Next, I want to get Houdini Engine working with Unity.